We are about to get started. Welcome everybody to Puerto Rico Energy in 60 Minutes. And happy Thursday evening. I'm Sam Tolman. I'm Director of Energy Services for Green Power Technologies, Puerto Rico. We develop small hydroelectric projects in Puerto Rico, around the Caribbean, and in the United States. I'm joined by my conversation partner, Tom King, fresh out of the White House. How's it going, Tom?
It's going a lot better. 2 beers in after leaving the White House and sitting in a nice bar, kind of a couple blocks away, killing time doing this segment, and I got a flight later tonight. So it's been a busy day and a long one so far. Looking forward to this conversation with Elisa.
Yeah, one of the things that Tom and I have been talking about for a while is and particularly around microgrids, and it's why we put it on the agenda for our event next week, is the diversification of different energy solutions for Puerto Rico. I think a lot of people are focused on the very hyper distributed side, and we're not going to just talk about microgrids, but given our guests' experience with microgrid knowledge and writing about microgrids and studying microgrids for a while, that's definitely going to be a large piece of the conversation. Hyper central, decentralized, or totally centralized, and of course the answer has to lie somewhere in the nuance, in the middle, right? And so it's yes, and it's both of those, and some sort of creative solution in the middle, combining the different technologies. Before we get into our conversation, I'm going to just quickly share my screen. We are just a couple of days away from our marquee event, Tuesday, September 24th at Vivo Beach Club. We are presenting a National Clean Energy Week event, Puerto Rico Leadership in the Energy Transition. Our conversation tonight is an awesome preview to a panel we'll be having with microgrid experts here in Puerto Rico. We'll also have panels on energy demand and what that trajectory looks like, as well as the role of natural gas in the transition. We're going to have speakers talking about nuclear energy. We're hosting this event at Vivo Beach Club, which is also the home of Ocean Lab Brewery. So we'll hear from them as an energy user about how they think about their own business growth, their energy needs, and how do they evaluate different technologies, financing options, efficiency measures, the way an end user ultimately thinks about energy. And of course, we'll be thinking about how to model the transition. The Department of Energy federally put out a study recently, the PR 100 study, many of you will be familiar with. There's a lot of analysis. It's a 900-page document, and there's a lot of thoughts about what's good, what's bad, what's missing, what needs to be more rigorous, what it gets right, what it teaches us, and so forth. So that's going to be a great event. If you haven't gotten a ticket yet, get a ticket. If you're going to be in Puerto Rico, you should be there. We'll have a presentation by the governor's office. They have proclaimed next week, in alignment with a number of other jurisdictions around the United States, National Clean Energy Week. And so we'll be hearing from the Deputy Secretary on Energy Affairs, Francisco Berrios Portela, on that, and he'll be making a formal announcement on that proclamation. And it's going to be a good time. We're going to have drinks. It would be irresponsible not to have a drink. It's at a brewery, after all. And so there'll be networking, there'll be some food, and of course, it'll be followed by a special edition of green drinks. So if you need more information, if you haven't gotten more information, reach out, get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to share it. Tom, anything I'm missing on that? Any other housekeeping notes from your end?
No, I think you're covering it brilliantly. We're warming up for a big event. Lots and lots of pieces of it. I think having been at the White House, and a lot of people talked about around energy, and I talked about energy. It's interesting how much of the conversation was focused around solar and storage and wind. But the PR 100 study is a good study, but it advocates an all of the above strategy, right? In terms of getting stability, getting to growth, getting to lower prices, transitioning to effectively a net zero future. And there absolutely are pathways, and I think it's a good study. Yeah, I think it disappointed a lot of people in that it didn't make more specific recommendations at the end of the day, which people I think were counting on, and they also wanted information on just how much and how fast we could integrate intermittent renewables and things into the grid, and that is not part of the study. But it is hugely helpful. But it reminds me that Republicans and Democrats tend to use different language to describe the same thing. And I find Republicans will only talk about all of the above, but they're quite happy to push for all renewable, all solar, all wind when it makes economic sense in places like Texas, etc. Democrats will only talk about wind and solar, but they act on all of the above basis in terms of transitioning and strengthening the grid with microgrids and other types of things. So we have similar situations, but we have different, I think, parties and allegiances, and an overlay of the bankruptcy and a number of other things that are back in the news this week as well. So looking forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to segue into our segment today. We are joined by Elisa Wood. Elisa is the editor and founder of energychangemakers.com. She's co-founder and was editor of Microgrid Knowledge, writer on all things energy, focused on distributed energy microgrids. And I'll let you know, Elisa, when you Google your name, Elijah Wood from Frodo Baggins fame ends up taking a lot of space on the Google results page. So
he's my SEO nemesis.
Yes, I believe it. So you wrote that the energy grid was having a smartphone moment. What do you mean by that?
So I wrote that a while ago. So you're testing me. It's funny when I've been writing about energy for over 30 years, and and I will run into articles sometimes when I'm Googling around for some information, and I'll think, this is an interesting article, and then I realize, I wrote that 10 years ago. That's my article. So, but yeah, the smartphone analogy, that's one. It wasn't original with me. Other people have used that. The idea is just that energy is becoming more and more manageable by the individual. It's becoming more of a device that we can control locally, and that can kind of be it's more personalized, I guess is the best way to describe it. Energy is becoming more personalized. And that's kind of the key with distributed energy. We're looking at, I like to use the word local energy because I think that's really what it's about. It's about bringing it locally to the community. And Tom, I was listening to you with real interest when you were talking about sort of the Democrat and the Republican versions of clean energy, and how they're really not that different. They're just kind of using different terminology, right? When I was at Microgrid Knowledge, there was a group called the Civil Society Institute that was doing polling of voters to get their views on microgrids. In fact, they made microgrids sort of a mission of theirs because they're a group that tries to find things that both sides of the aisle can support. And they found that was definitely the case with microgrids. Both sides of the aisle supported microgrids, but for totally different reasons and using completely different language. The Republicans were about security, while the Democrats were about, climate change. So it's kind of interesting to see that dichotomy that's out there. I was also interested in what you were saying because I think one thing we don't talk about enough is how we get there in terms of where do we begin. And I think the presumption is that we begin big, right? We begin by building lots of big wind farms and solar farms. Well, that's running into a lot of trouble. We're having problems getting these projects interconnected. I think there's a 2-year delay now. We're having problems with people just not wanting big stuff in their backyard, even if it's benevolent, like wind and solar. So I'm not saying that's a good thing that they don't want it, but I'm saying that's a reality. And so maybe we're thinking in the wrong direction. Rather than building sort of from the top down, there's a gentleman in our in the energy changemakers community, Lorenzo Christoph. You may have heard of him. He's a good architect. Great interview, by the way. He's kind of a darling on the podcast circuit if you're looking for another interview about local energy. But one of the things he talks about is that we need to start thinking about building energy from the bottom up, from the community, from the homes. We need to do as much of that as we can do, right? Get those rooftops, those warehouses, everything, get the solar there. And then start thinking about, what do you do after that? What do you need to do? What does the grid need after that? So we need to sort of, I think, reverse our thinking a little bit about not just what we're going to do or how we describe it, but how we begin. We don't ever begin, for some reason, on that local level, the community level. We start with the big picture first, the big things first.
I think it's an interesting analysis. I mean, and just going back to the analog for the smartphone for a moment, because, and maybe zooming out from that, the personal computing or the computing revolution, I think, is another historical precedent for this type of thing, that could never start on the local level, though. And it was something that technologically, as well as from a financing perspective, had to be central mainframes. And then over time and technological advances, we now have some of the most, powerful, computers in our pockets. We're sort of seeing a regression of that in some ways, with which people are saying, okay, I'm going to actually have to centralize it again to figure out how to do it myself and take more control over my own power. Even our computing has, some centralization to it, right? In terms of tying into broader telecom networks. But microgrids and DERs in particular seem to be people saying, I'm actually going to just build my own computers. I'm going to build my own computing system and really take total control over how much power I have to do the analysis I need to do.
And we did go from large to small there, right? We started with when the grid, we started with creating a central grid, and now we're talking about decentralizing it, right? We started with, so it really is kind of the same thing, just like with computers, we started with the mainframes, right? So we're working our way down to local.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's not technically true, though, is it? Right? I mean, in the early days, everybody had their own plant. Everybody had their own power plant, whether it was a factory or a street or a block or a neighborhood. And then you started having utilities. Then you had a grand consolidation. And so all of these little microgrids effectively were all bought up and integrated into the big central grid, so that they could get to scale and get the economics, so that they could spread electricity to everybody else.
You're going way back. I didn't go back. I didn't go back that far.
I'm going right to the beginning. So in a way, we're going full circle and coming back to where it was before. But we now have a means of measuring and integrating all of these without centralizing them. And so, yeah.
Right. You've probably seen some of those pictures of those early days, the Edison, when people were actually, like, different companies were crossing wires across the street to, to get to customers, which made for a good argument for more centralization at that point in time.
So I think there's still a collective action problem, and thinking about sort of the economic and policy dimensions of DERs. One of the conversations that Tom and I have regularly is regarding utility economics, and thinking somewhere between, I don't know, 35 and 50% of Americans rent versus our homeowners. I've got a couple of different questions on this area, but thinking about that potentially half of the population, to what extent do DERs represent a duplication of efforts because of the need for centralized power for them, or are the owners of those homes and condos and apartment buildings, are they moving towards microgrids as well? And so it's sort of moot, and they have their own incentive mechanisms. And I don't own my roof, right? I live in a house here in Puerto Rico, but I don't own, I rent, and I don't own my roof. Where does the market bifurcate, or do those two elements ultimately converge?
Well, two things. One is, of course, if we're talking just about solar, there's community solar, which is a great option for somebody who lives in an apartment or has a shaded roof like I do. But the other thing, it's interesting you bring this up because I'm about to record a podcast with somebody who's doing something very revolutionary. They are creating an off-grid apartment building within a city. So we're not talking about off in the mountains, right? We're talking about within a city. And, they're using fuel cells, they're using solar, and they looked at the economics, they looked at what the utility rate is, they looked at, issues in interconnecting, and they said, you know what? We are simply better off. And this is a pretty big, like, multifamily complex. And it's a, like, it's got all the bells and whistles. It's nice. And they're just deciding to take it completely off grid. It's an off grid microgrid, basically. So, and their goal is to make this replicable so that other multifamily houses can do this. So I think there is a pathway for people who are apartment dwellers. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Almost nothing's going to happen tomorrow, right? The energy revolutions are very slow. But I think we're starting to see that. And this whole off-grid phenomenon in urban areas in California, it really surprises me. I mean, for so many years, we all said, oh, in solar microgrids, you want to interconnect. And yeah, there's a lot of good reasons to interconnect. But there are definitely, companies, there's a hotel in New York City, that is off-grid because they said it's cheaper for them to be off-grid. There are wineries and other commercial and industrial facilities in California that said, we're just going to create the microgrid. And if eventually we can interconnect, great, maybe we will. But it's really hard to interconnect. There's a huge wait. And, we're not real happy with what's going on with utilities here anyway. And it's just better for us to just operate off grid for now and maybe forever. So I think there is definitely a pathway. It's just probably not the one we thought would occur.
And are, that big hotel project you referenced, are they doing it for cost or for carbon emission reduction? What's the main driver? Cost.
It's cost. New York City, it's, in New York, energy prices are very high. And so it's about cost for them. It's a combined heat and power microgrid. Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that we've seen in Puerto Rico for the most part, where microgrids on the industrial level have been very successful. 50% of the local economy is in manufacturing. Many of these, about 90% of that is in the pharmaceutical and medical device sectors. And so very highly regulated, very demanding with regards to not only reliable electricity, but with regards to the conditions they meet in terms of good manufacturing practices and the like. They are operating within a baseline environment where standard monopoly economics, you have traditionally one provider at a high cost, relatively low reliability, and they're presented with an alternative where they can potentially pay significantly less for significantly higher quality. And that's not even getting into the piece of the puzzle of avoiding the costs of outages and the unreliability of a grid. I was just talking to one of our panelists who will be with us next week at the National Clean Energy Week event. And with the ability to load follow, with that many of the centralized systems, not just in Puerto Rico but across the world, don't have, then it becomes very challenging to maintain a stable voltage and actually really be able to operate the equipment. These are high tech, highly robotic, automated, and like I said, highly regulated industries that won't even flirt with the idea of having an energy excursion, let alone an outage, but just a voltage excursion. And so they've been successful. Microgrids otherwise in Puerto Rico have been relatively challenged to get off the ground. Lots of residential solar, so strong DER market broadly, but the microgrid regulation and Tom's, you can get into this more. One of your big bugaboos is that there's a sort of a regulatory vacuum on what actually are the guidelines for doing it. There is a regulation in Puerto Rico that makes it very clear that Regulation 9028 that states that microgrids are a key component of the strategy to rebuild and strengthen the grid. And then they sort of stop there. They don't provide a whole lot of other guidance on how to do community solar, for instance, is not a reality in Puerto Rico.
Nope.
So industrial microgrids are the most replicable, and that looks, in hospitality as well has moved in that direction from a CHP perspective. But really, those are the ones that are moving forward with microgrids.
Yeah, and those have been very successful. I mean, relatively speaking, there are lots and lots of industrial users that have moved forward with microgrids of their own. Mixing, a lot of LPG, a lot of liquefied petroleum gas is used to support the industrial process that are generating with that. They're also incorporating solar and storage and a number of the things into these microgrids. But that's about as far as they can go, and even that we'll hear from Angel Dias in particular, maybe Adiel on the panel. There's huge holdups in getting the right permits and the right interconnections and things set up just for these stinker guys, and yet these are being very successful. There's really nothing for the multitude of different hybrid forms that are coming out in Puerto Rico. Things that I refer to as virtual microgrids that kind of established by multiple points of interconnect and multiple solar and storage, particularly across different neighborhoods. And then you've got folks that are proposing to carve out different smaller sections of the existing grid and create an ability to generate an island that critical area to support different estimates, even beyond the larger regional grid microgrid setups that. And unfortunately, we have one word, microgrid, that doesn't really define everything that's going on, which has long been, and others have been of mine, it's one name doesn't cover all these things. Regional grids, microgrids, nano grids, gigagrids. I don't know what you want to call them, but they're very different, and they have very different needs. And there's no regulation to support them. How do you do it? What do you do? What are your responsibilities as a microgrid operator? What's the responsibility of the grid in these circumstances? How do you incorporate virtual net metering, which is an interesting part of it that does exist in Puerto Rico. Has limited use so far. Who owns the customer, right? If you've got a solar and battery system at a house and they're connected to the grid, well, technically you both own the customer. But if you set up a virtual microgrid, then technically Luma doesn't own the customer anymore. Technically, you're the customer as the microgrid operator at that meter and every other meter that you do. So there's no thinking yet to establish this, no regulation, no contractual format, and without that, you've got no understanding of the risks and application and operations, which means that you can't finance it. So if we want to do more, we want to get money in, we've got to start answering some of these questions.
It goes back to the question.
Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, this is the big problem, right? With the whole energy transition is that a lot of the terms you used, if you went to speak to regulators about those, they wouldn't really have a lot of insight. I mean, it's astonishing. There's been some reports in the press and like in Florida where there were just some basic terms that the regulators didn't know. I mean, there's just such a gap between this industry is moving so fast, the technology is moving so fast, and the regulatory understanding is way behind. And it's a big one.
I actually have some hope there, but we're not really ever anywhere close to a tipping point. But I remember working a little more than a decade ago when utilities across the country had no idea what cybersecurity was. Right? They didn't even have plans for it. They didn't have any idea what their vulnerabilities were, and it was something that began small and grew. And now virtually every utility and every regulator understands that this needs to be addressed, and there are formats and forms and steps that people have to take. And the language of it is I wouldn't say it's universally understood, but every regulator has to know it, and every utility is regulated has to know it. So Maybe it'll be the same with us with microgrids.
Maybe, but microgrids have been around that long too, right? And but there's one big difference between microgrids and a cybersecurity program is that a microgrid is probably going to or could erode the utility rate base, right? While cybersecurity is probably something they can rate base. And I think that
Yeah,
anything they could rate base gets moved a lot faster.
I think I think we also about the same time I was doing a lot of work in and out of say the security apparatus for the DNI, and the DNI was very much behind the growth in the education of cybersecurity within utilities. They like the idea of the resiliency impacts of distributed generation and microgrids, but they didn't put their thumb on the scale. If we get some of that, we might see this go a little further forward. Yeah.
So I have a question about cybersecurity, but before we get there, I want to go back to the utility economics point, Elisa, you were just making with regards to decentralized energy users taking taking the customer base away from the centralized utilities. Puerto Rico is coming out of a centralized monopoly utility type system. We have we are in the process right now of building, and the regulator in particular is in the process of building a distributed, open, competitive marketplace for energy type projects, energy-based projects. And at the same time, the utility has a lot of permanent work in the process to repair the grid, repair the T&D system, make sure the substations have the interconnection capabilities, repairing feeders all across the island. You've used an analogy in one of your articles, building, now it's escaped me, but basically flying the plane while you fix it. And actually, it's funny that Tom mentioned, not many people knowing what microgrids are. I think you've cited in that article that was the most read article from microgrid knowledge, just defining what is a microgrid. Importantly, you link to what a microgrid is not, and we can include both of those in the show notes to this episode, because I think they're just sort of baseline knowledge for people to really understand what it is that we're talking about, and those terms get perverted a little bit. But in terms of the utility needing to do massive upgrades, while at the same time people like industrial users in Puerto Rico, residential users with rooftop solar and storage, albeit not a microgrid, are not waiting. Their sense of urgency for their own reliable, lower cost electrical systems is present, and they're going to move forward anyway. How do we think about the balance between those two things? What is the right balance between mass adoption of DERs and sustainable long-term utility economic models that I use sustainable in the most literal sense here, that can sustain themselves in a changing grid where people are prosumers and people are potentially building their own systems to sell to their tenants in their apartments. It ends up cutting out something that still has to exist as far as I'm concerned, which is the central grid operator.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't see the central grid going away. I just see its role changing. And I think that's where the resistance is. It doesn't want to change its role. And as a result, we're seeing interesting things crop up. Like I just interviewed somebody recently from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm not sure if you've heard about what they're doing there, but they have a new take on the municipal utility. So, municipal utilities is every year there's a few cities, the state of Maine last year, which try to create public power, right? So the utility is owned by the city or the state or publicly rather than owned privately, because that's a lot of the economics of utilities. You can't talk about that without talking about the fact that most of them are investor owned, right? So, but that's hard to do. It's very, very hard to set up a city-owned or state-owned utility because the utilities resist it. They fight it. It's hard to figure out the economics. What do you owe the utility if you take over their wires and poles, right? Very complicated. So Ann Arbor, Michigan is going at it a different way. They're creating or trying to create. There's going to be a vote November 5th. We'll see then if this goes forward. But what the city is proposing is kind of a utility that operates in parallel to the investor-owned utility, which is DTE. And what that means is they're calling it a sustainable energy utility. But what it basically is it's a utility that provides distributed energy. So customers who want to join it, it's not mandatory, but anybody in the city who wants to join it can join, and then they can get solar panels on their roof. They can get, whatever kind of DER is going to work for them through the city. The city will manage it. The city will provide it. It's like a water utility, but rather than water, it's DERs. Again, a possible model that could be replicated anywhere. So I think that I don't know the answer to what the ideal economics are to make sure we have a central utility, a grid, a backup, a backbone all the time as DERs, because I think that's what we're going to have eventually, right? DERs are going to keep proliferating. It just seems to be a technology that's on the rise. People want it. It's moving. It just seems to be the way technology is moving in energy. So at some point we come to a place where it's kind of, okay, how does the utility support itself if all these kilowatt hours are being pulled away, right?
And that seems like yeah. No, I was just going to say that seems, so there's a couple of different axes here, right? There's grid reliability and decentralized energy flexibility. And then there's also base load versus intermittency. How do you see those two axes intersecting? Because, and maybe we get into battery storage as part of this conversation, but I work in hydroelectricity. Hydroelectricity is the first decentralized, power that Tom was mentioning, where plants would prop up, around the meanders of rivers, and that served as the basis for the first vertebrae, so to speak, for the backbone that turned into the centralized grid. That was base load. That ended up being really reliable power. A lot of the DERs that we're seeing now are particularly in Puerto Rico, are mostly solar based, if not exclusively solar based.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that we're not going to. It's not going to be all solar. I mean, it can't be all solar. It's going to have to be other. We're going to have other forms of generation in there as well. I mean, the key is the mix, right? Getting the right mix to resolve those intermittency problems. Whether that's batteries or hydro or something else, but it's the mix, it's the software, right? And it's the generation. So, what is the ideal mix? I don't have the answer to that. I don't think we're near there yet. I don't think we're at that point where we're worrying about that quite yet. In most places, we don't have enough solar in most places. There are some exceptions yet to worry about that.
The model you mentioned, I mean, we developed it 4.5 years ago in Puerto Rico. I mean, it's kind of what I refer to as the virtual microgrid, starting with the Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica de Montaña and Maria Enfoque project, where you're looking at installing solar storage, at sites to serve the needs of those sites. Potentially in Puerto Rico, you're doing some physical interconnection as well at town centers, little villages and things in the mountains. But by and large, you still have a connection to the grid. In the initial situation, you're providing those panels. You're providing a lease charge within a cooperative structure, so the beneficiaries become owners as well. As you grow and you get bigger and you have surplus power effectively, if you can manage, you can virtually net meter, provide service to the grid. You could also potentially start hooking up third parties without solar by adding a meter and serving that. So this is something that they've been developing and working on. They have not been able to get a big enough chunk of funding to do the whole thing that you need to roll out to get to scale, so that you can cover your operating expenses for O&M and maintenance and a number of other things that a city has a little easier time getting to that point and organizing. But it's still there. It's still on its way, and several other communities have copied the essence of that, including La Margarita in Salinas, etc. So we're really waiting for another round of regulation and contractual setups with the grid, so that you can underpin how is this actually going to work, not how we see it working, in order to convince investors, lenders, others that this is a good thing to put money into. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So, and I have to ask you about something else you talked about earlier, because I think
Yeah.
I lost track of this somewhere. At one point, there was talk about segmenting Puerto Rico's grid into, I think it was 8 microgrids, mini grids, whatever they were calling them, but they were like these large microgrids. And I think
Yep.
you were saying there's still something on the table there with that concept. Is that because that kind of
Yeah.
addresses your question, Sam, of like,
Yeah.
you know, how do you manage it all? Well, if you have several microgrids that are interacting, I mean, that's the dream of the future, right? That's what's happening with this big Chicago experiment going on. So
Yeah,
where does that all stand?
it's not clear, and a lot of it stands with doing major grid repairs that enable that to even happen in the first place. One of the things that it ends up posing as a question is who ends up being these 8 regional utility operators or grid managers as well, because that is just a conversation towards decentralization that's never taken place in Puerto Rico and would elevate, I think, importantly, municipal leadership in a way they've never been empowered on the island to do. And so there's a level of governance there that doesn't currently exist. That's one challenge. But then also just the technical strength of the grid is one that is, Tom, add to that. But there's a technical issue and there's a policy and governmental culture issue as well, just with regards to who ends up becoming the owner of that type of infrastructure.
So
Is there any discussion? Oh, I was just going to ask, is there any discussion of creating some kind of DSO? Like, Maine is talking about that now, looking pretty seriously into it. A distributed system operator that would manage this?
yeah, it's early days, right? So, but I think there was originally, I can't remember whether it was Burns and McDonald working with Goldman Sachs or other people at the very beginning when the storm hit and everything got wiped out and we had Build Back Better and we were looking at resiliency. And there was a quick study or plan put together that actually divided the island up into a bunch more zones than that, right? And we're going to have that. So create cells of resiliency within an ultimately reorganized, restructured grid. And it's a good basic concept. So people are still playing with that. Luma is thinking about that. How does this get rebuilt? People want the billions that are still yet to come. That will repair and open up the grid to be able to create resiliency, do things like that. I don't think they're thinking about having independent operators of each of the cells. I think they're really talking about just ways that they can better organize and create the individual and group resiliency. If something happens on one, it doesn't take down everything else. You're able to run in one operation at that level, but then there's microgrids and microgrids, etc. So there's definitely looking at this as an operating scheme of the future. Going from central out to multiple centers of resiliency that can potentially share power, operate independently when things go down, but so that you don't end up with the cascading failures that you typically have through systems, and where island systems, in particular islands in the pathways of hurricanes, can be particularly vulnerable.
There's more
I think
engineering.
another major barrier
Yeah.
for that type of thing is that not all of those 8 mini grids as they're currently drawn out, have generation assets in them. And so currently, almost all of the generation is done on the South Coast. Almost all of the demand is on the North Coast. And part of the challenge is the T&D that's connecting them. There are grids that are currently drawn out right there that, in those initial maps, where you would be, you'd have to build entirely new generation assets to meet the population's demand. That is its own, as Tom said, early days in even just repairing what's there. We've got to get the plane off the ground before we can fly it and fix it at the same time. And it's currently deeply wounded. It's one of the reasons why there's I think by the end of the year we'll have the second or third largest residential solar market in the country, is because and have such expertise on the residential or on the industrial microgrid side, that they're maybe optimistic, but they won't wait, and so they're moving forward with their own systems today because they can't afford not to. One, yeah, sorry, go
I
ahead,
know,
Tom. And
I
then I've
know
got a
the,
question.
the DOE Grid Development Office and NREL, et cetera, have been, supporting this study, this thinking, in the background as well. I didn't want it to come off like, oh, it's an idealist thing. And CP just pointed out, it's like right now the regions that they're talking about are based on old like service districts, and there's no existing independent generation or design within that. But it's not the worst place to start to think about where you start drawing lines on a map in order to build that sort of cellular resiliency. That's the way it goes. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Elisa, what technological innovation would most accelerate the deployment of distributed energy systems?
Ooh, that's a good question. What technological innovation? So basically, you're asking me what's blocking innovation in DERs at this point in time? Boy, it's funny because I tend to focus more on the market obstructions and the regulatory obstructions. Haven't really thought about the technical obstructions. I'm guessing you have an idea. What are you thinking?
So, I mean, I think there's some companies in Puerto Rico, I think smart inverters that are really able to, balance the bidirectionality of the DERs with the grid. I think that's a major innovation. I think AI has a lot to play here. And in fact, one of the questions I wanted to pose to you is how do you envision AI impacting the energy sector? And maybe there's two different directions to take that. One is AI requires a huge amount of computing power, and all of these data centers will ultimately look a lot like microgrids or will be microgrids. And on the other hand, I think there's a lot of design power that can come out of artificial intelligence models that can help us understand really okay, if those 8 mini grids are not the right formation based on understanding the hosting capacity of the grid, the current capacity of generation assets across the island, trends with regards to economic growth and outmigration, there's a lot of big data there that may not be so easy to wade through with the naked eye, but with an AI model an AI model that's based in a microgrid might be able to help us design better microgrids.
Yeah, definitely. The AI model definitely seems to hold a lot of promise for this microgrid within microgrid concept, or the concept of having a lot of different DERs out there that we have to coordinate, that we're doing now through DERMS and whatnot. And can we make those DERMS programs more sophisticated so that there's more sharing, and more efficiency, of these different disparate DERs that are out there. But I want to jump back to what you're saying about the other side of it, because that's really fascinating, and I'm hearing some interesting discussions around AI and the amount of energy it's going to require and how we're going to build to it. And I don't think there's any simple answers out there right now. But one of the fears I've been hearing lately, and I'm not sure if this is just a rumor in some echo chamber or what it is, but it's kind of amusing to think about. Maybe not amusing, maybe scary is a better word. Somebody pointed out that these data centers, these tech companies, are certainly wealthy enough, of course, to build their own generation. But beyond that, they're wealthy enough to try to buy the utilities and just take it over from that end and say, hey, we're tired of this mess. Let's go and take it over. So, I mean, the amount of control and I'm sure there would be massive regulatory, battles, and states and government and federal government have a lot to say about that. But it's an interesting thought when you think about the balance of power, and I mean power not in terms of electricity out there right now, that has the ability to influence the electric grid. The other big
There are a couple cases though of these larger data centers actually buying power plants, not utilities, but power plants that provided into the grid and effectively redirected those resources priority to them, whether it was directly interconnected or whether they were using it to offset and say, well, no, this is our power, now because it's opened up. So that's created a few alarms. So those things are are happening, but not in the sort of we're taking over the utility. It's more we're taking over this asset that you
Well,
used to be able to count on for the grid.
You can almost feel
Yeah.
sympathy for the utility in this situation, right? Because they're in this potentially all of a sudden they have potentially a massive new market here, right? But that new market is so wealthy, it could just go build itself without them. So
well,
they're in
and I think it looks a little bit like the historical precedent we were talking about earlier of the origins of power being decentralized, and these textile manufacturers on the side of a river that were able to produce more power in their hydro systems to sell it to the rest of the town ended up becoming the utilities. And so,
Mhm.
you know, I'd be curious if they end up going in the acquisition route versus we're just going to build our own system and end up becoming an independent power producer, because we we want the generation on site. It's not a matter of just being in control of the generation if it's elsewhere. It's having the reliability right exactly where I want it. And so it may not be sufficient for them to just take over an operating utility, but really to create some form of competitive model there.
Right.
And you know, go ahead on that if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. And the other thing that's happening, of course, is that they're buying up the solar and wind power purchase agreements. And so other entities with sustainability goals are having trouble securing that power. So yeah, they are like cornering a market here. You know, it seems that way, that they have the ability and they're already showing signs of it.
Depending on how much power they really need, it might be an innovative driver for new technologies in, you know, smaller scale, advanced nuclear, and other distributed systems. I just saw an article recently that a small university in Texas, has gotten FERC approval to develop a small nuclear facility, one of the smallest nuclear facilities to be built, and it's going to be a laboratory, and so that might present its own type of model where where we have technological advancement in a way that wouldn't happen on the utility level.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's definitely going to drive. Of course, the other big question here too is how much power do they really need? And I hear a lot of debate over that. You know, how much is this demand growth that's being projected? How much, you know, is it realistic? Is it really going to be as much? I mean, there are people who think, you know, data centers are going to become more and more efficient. So these going out 5 years or so, we're not going to need the level of power that we're now saying, that they're now saying, or the utilities are now saying they're going to need. So then there's the whole stranded cost issue. You know, we have to be so careful about not overbuilding. But if it's not a utility model, if they're doing it privately, then you don't have that issue.
Well, and it goes back to my question about base load versus intermittency, and you know, I think there should be part of the goal is not duplicating efforts, and having a lot over redundancy is not necessarily a good thing. I think,
Yes.
you know, one of the topics that's interested Tom and myself, and in fact, our first Puerto Rico Energy Forum conversation was around workforce. The fact that DERs are being adopted on a pretty broad scale in almost every market, across a lot of technologies, it poses the question of what skill sets are we not developing, are we underrating, that, you know, we might have grandfathered in because of an older centralized power model that really are no longer appropriate for a DER microgridded, or at least a hybrid system where we have interoperability between distributed resources and a centralized system. If you know, or in your view of the market, what skill sets are dearly lacking that we might be underdeveloping?
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up. My mind went to nuclear power, and all of the people who went into nuclear power only to find they didn't have jobs anymore as that ebbed. But you know, just over and over and over again, what I hear from people is we need engineers, we need engineers, we need engineers. So and then to probably a lesser degree, you know, there's the marketing, sales, because there's a lot of, you know, it's a whole different field. Right now you no longer, when you go from centralized power to distributed power, and you're selling to consumers, all of a sudden you have a whole different kind of workforce that you need to develop, right? You need to develop people who know, it has to be a pretty sophisticated workforce that can educate people about energy, because most people aren't very familiar with energy. So it's not just any salesperson that you can, that's been selling widgets that can come in and talk about microgrids or, virtual power plants to consumers. So I'd say that the two areas I see it the most are engineering, always. And the second thing is an educated sales or marketing force that can actually communicate about these new technologies to folks. So any college, anybody's out there, and thinking about what they're going to major in college, if you're an engineer, go for it, an energy engineer. And if you're thinking of something in education, communications, marketing, think about learning about energy.
Let me pose two ideas here of additional skill sets that I think are going to be critically important, and let me get your thoughts on them. I think one, cybersecurity is critically important. We now have a lot of diversity with regards to the systems that are communicating with what is critical infrastructure, particularly if they're not fully islanded, right? So you have the whole system integration and interoperability between somebody's own DER and the broader grid could potentially pose significant threats to bad actors, to put it broadly, that may want to enter into that system, whereas centralized systems have, more, maybe this isn't entirely the case, but more of a one front door type of cybersecurity policy. And now you have, we have one of the largest DER systems with regards to residential solar. What risk does that pose to the broader system? That's one. And I think the other one is on a data analytics side of predictive maintenance, balancing, understanding. We now have a lot of data points that we never previously had. Of course, we had meters on everybody's houses and businesses and whatnot, but now we have data on bidirectional electricity flow, battery storage, demand, requirements with regards to flexibility. Those two areas strike me as ones that may not be as highly rated in a more traditional system, and I think without which a DER based system will not be successful.
No, I agree with you completely. Yeah, on the data analytics, I mean, there's so much information that's being collected now, and the utilities don't even know what to do with it all, right? So we definitely need people who know how to manage that and read it and put it to use. But on cybersecurity, I was thinking when I was hearing about the bombs that went off, the pagers, right? It was the pagers
in
Lebanon.
Pagers and then walkie-talkies.
And then walkie-talkies. And I heard that the manufacturing company said they hadn't manufactured these in 10 years. And so I was thinking, well, okay, so one of two things happened. Somebody installed these after the fact, right? Installed these bombs, whatever they were. Or the big fear that I used to hear about a lot in cybersecurity and utilities was that we buy components from all around the world, and some of them are sitting there for years and years and years, and you don't know what could be unleashed in those components at a later date. So
yeah, welcome to Huawei.
Cybersecurity is, yeah.
That's what the big fear is, right? It's more of a software worm fear than a they can blow it up kind of fear. But yeah, it's real. So,
well, and I think from a grid perspective, it's mostly a software perspective. On the pager, that's a fascinating. Well, there'll be incredible spy-like movies that will come out about that.
Yeah, I already know.
I think it's as much a hardware thing as much as a software one, and I think that that's where regulatory bodies, from going back to the energy sector, where we're having a regulatory body that can cope with the complexity of diverse systems and be able to say, okay, this type of equipment is regulated and appropriate to be in communication with the rest of it, with the rest of the grid, ends up becoming ultimately important. And I think that's another skill set that we might not have properly developed. We might have regulatory experts for a traditional system, but ones that know how a bunch of distributed systems communicate with a central brain, that seems underdeveloped as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. Yep.
And I had one of my questions here, which is, what's the most dystopian potential outcome for a widespread adoption of distributed energy resources? That might be it. We might have just.
That's probably it.
Yeah.
I think you got
Yeah.
it. I think you hit on that one for sure. Yeah.
It's our power throw up the walls. The rest of you stay out. That could be your future. Little islands of wealth and safety and people without. But I don't think that's likely. That's possible.
So you mentioned the case study in Michigan. Are there other countries or regions that, in your mind, are doing the best job to foster, on the topic of regulatory environments, a regulatory regime for DERs?
Well, I think in Europe in general, they're more open to the distributed system operator approach. And so that definitely fosters more DERs. And then, we haven't talked about EVs either. I mean, where there are EVs, I think EVs are going to be a driver for more decentralization. They're a way for people to understand it. I've got a car, I can plug it in. Oh, this means I have this unit of the grid in my garage. And I think so as that grows, I think we're going to see more and more interest in DERs. There's been a lot of talk about EV market has been slow lately, or slower than expected. I guess it's important to distinguish. It's still growing in the US, but it didn't make its forecasts. I've talked to people who have argued that the problem isn't the market, the problem is the forecasts, that they were based on sales figures coming out of COVID.
The old hockey stick?
Yeah, the old hockey stick, exactly. The old hockey stick never fails, or I should say always fails.
Always fail.
I think that's, but I do think that EVs really, we haven't talked about them yet, but they're really central to this whole discussion. Because
certainly
again,
on the mainland, right?
Yes. What's the EV situation in Puerto Rico? What are you?
There's expected to be growth. I mean, Puerto Ricans a bit like Cubans, huge car culture in Puerto Rico. People invest a lot in their automobiles historically. But the difference, of course, is that EVs tend to go along with people who have solar and batteries already, right? I mean, they've got supply for the car, and they design their systems quite often when they're putting them in to be able to accommodate the charging needs of their vehicle or vehicles, as they go. So it's different though in terms of outlook, right? In terms of battery, because in Puerto Rico there's hardly any solar systems installed anywhere without batteries, right? Now that's not the case on the mainland. I mean, there's lots of people that install solar panels. It's only getting up to, I think, about somebody told me the number the other day. It's like 40% of new installs in California are now done with batteries. But that probably has something to do with the fires, which drove a lot of people to want to have greater on-site resiliency because they lost power for a long period of time. But there, also some credit to the utilities who are beginning to ratchet around the net metering. So the benefit that you get of putting things on, now we're encouraging you to buy a battery, save that power, and use it when you need it, so that you don't, put pressure on the grid when we don't want to give you power. So,
yeah, I've talked to microgrid developers who say that change in net metering in California really spurred a lot of microgrid development in that state, despite the fact that there's a lot of obstructions to microgrid development in California.
I think two of the key barriers to broader EV adoption in Puerto Rico are, one, just the economic means for people to be able to buy those cars, and until the cost of the average EV goes down, I think that'll be a very sticky barrier. It's the economics of it. And I think the other one of the articles, Elisa, that turned me on to your broader body of work was, why do microgrids or why do data centers use diesel generators? And I think that there is something fundamentally true in people's minds that a gas car, when the grid's down, will still go. and in a world where we have an unreliable grid with very high costs of electricity, if you have an EV, you tend to have the means to also have a battery system at home, and those two things end up, compounding. And people say, we don't face the same struggle where people will say, okay, I'm going to have long distances to drive where there may not be the charging infrastructure. Puerto Rico is 100 miles by 35, more or less, and so we don't face that same issue. The main challenge would be, is it going to be very costly to charge, and is it going to be unreliable if I can't charge it? And so those are real barriers that people face. We are coming up on our hour here. I have one more question for you, that has nothing to do with microgrids, but you are a graduate of the University of Iowa. Do you have a favorite writer out of the Iowa school?
Yeah, so I didn't graduate from there. I went over to Emerson from there, but I was in the journalism school there, and I favorite writer from Iowa. I have a favorite writer from Emerson, which is Mary Carr. She's a memoirist. So I think that's my kind of like college history favorite writer. I took a class with her. She was wonderful. Do you have a favorite writer? Is that why you're asking me? Is there somebody you're thinking of?
Well, the University of Iowa just has such a storied writing program, and I'm currently reading the collective stories of Flannery O'Connor, and so
of course,
Southern Gothic short stories.
Phenomenal.
Then Flannery O'Connor would be where to go. Elisa, where can people follow your work? How do people keep up with energy change makers? How do they get involved with your initiatives?
Yeah, so basically we are a platform that provides community and content for those working on the grid edge. You can find me at energychangemakers.com. We have a free newsletter, which I'd love it if you signed up for. We also have recently started our own podcast, Energy Changemakers Podcast. You can just Google that and it'll come up, and love it if you follow us.
Yeah.
So that's who we are. I wish I could have answered one more question though. And that was, I didn't get a chance to say what my favorite like dystopian picture was. Because going back to data centers, right? They take over all of the energy, and all of a sudden you have to have these like, Han Solo type people who are trying to steal energy from the data centers because the rest of us don't have any. We don't have any power. Anyway,
add AI and you've got the Matrix.
There you go. Yeah.
Like a Mad Max type of world where, everybody's going after the data centers.
Yeah.
Our guest tonight has been Elisa Wood. Elisa, thank you for being a part of Puerto Rico Energy in 60 Minutes.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here very much. I appreciate you having me.